If there was a list of Bible stories that people may want to avoid when preaching to their congregations, today's gospel lesson about the wedding at Cana would not be on that list. At least it probably wouldn't crack the top 100. There are a lot more Bible stories with more obvious hang-ups: violence and sex, unsettling theological implications. The Bible has some crazy stories. But, and knowing that this water into wine story wouldn't make it onto this metaphorical list, I can tell you something about the authors of this metaphorical list. They are not children and youth ministers. Let me tell you what I mean. Our story begins with Jesus, the protagonist of all Christianity, arguing with his mother. I can't preach about that. And by the way, any children or grown children or mother, you'll all understand this. If you're ever speaking to your mother and you decide to start the sentence with, "Woman," bad choice. Don't do that. Next, in the story, Jesus creates a bulk amount of alcohol. 6 stone pots filled to the brim. And the translations actually differ a bit on exactly how much these stone pots held. But our translation, the NRSV, says each pot had held 20 to 30 gallons of water. Do a brief bit of math. We're talking 120 to 180 gallons of wine. I can't preach about that. And of course, to cap it off, Jesus made this wine not just for any reason, but intentionally to serve it to a crowd of already drunk guests, including the newlywed couple and their friends, many of who were probably teenagers. This story is a minefield. So, I got lucky and something else did stick out into this story, something that I actually can preach about. And it says these stone jars that Jesus filled with water and then turned into wine. The jars were actually dedicated to the Jewish rites of purification. And according to Jewish law, it was required that you wash your hands before and after every meal, which seems practical, right? I mean, especially these days, we can all get behind hand washing, can't we? But the weddings, see, they would have many guests, and the parties weren't just for a couple hours, but they would go on for days and days on end. So there was a lot of meals to be eaten and a lot of guests there, so you needed a lot of water for this ritual washing. And the stone pots then would be filled with flowing water, water from a running source, which they would also call living water, because it was cleaner than water pulled from a stagnant pool. And then they would scoop this water out of the jars and pour it over their hands to wash before and after every meal. Again, it's practical. It makes sense. But the thing about this ancient hand-washing practice, and it makes it a bit tougher for us to understand in a modern lens, is that they don't know about germs and bacteria like we do. The hand-washing for them was about becoming ritually clean rather than becoming physically clean. They were aiming to purify rather than to sanitize. They were less concerned about washing away germs and more concerned about washing away the sin. Because these large stone jars, they did serve a practical purpose, but it was also a dedicated religious purpose, because the water in those jars was dedicated. It had its purpose set already. So when Jesus has these pots filled and then transforms that water into wine, this would be a bit like someone using our font as a punch bowl. It feels a bit sacrilegious. And then when you add to this the natural consequence of Jesus' miracle, now there's no water left to wash in. Jesus didn't turn just any water into wine. He turned this water into wine, and in doing so, he made a choice. He decided that it was more important to continue the wedding celebration, to save the newlyweds from the embarrassment of running out of wine, and to listen to his mom. He chose love over purity. For my second interview to become St. Andrew's Children and Youth Ministry Coordinator back in 2018, I was asked to prepare a full-length lesson and teach it, just like I would in a Sunday youth group. I had about a week or so to prepare this lesson, and I was 90% finished with it when my preparation was interrupted by then-President Donald Trump's announcement of his zero-tolerance policy for asylum seekers at U.S. borders. My heart was broken by this. And suddenly it became all I could think about, and I stopped me from finishing my lesson because I knew that I couldn't go and teach something that wasn't the thing that was on my heart. So with about 24 hours left before this second interview, I created a new lesson. I began the lesson by handing each member of the hiring committee, which consisted of probably some of you and some teenagers, I handed each of them a Dixie cup. And I asked each of them to spit in the cup, like really spit in it. Safe start, right? I then asked each of them to look at what they had put in their cup and then to drink it. Gross, right? Yeah, I was pretty sure at that point that I wasn't getting the job. But to my surprise, they did it. All of them. Some hesitated more than others, but they all did it, or at least they acted like they did it well enough to convince me. I first heard about this spit cup exercise in a book I was assigned to read in an undergrad class at Warner Pacific College. The book is called Unclean: Meditations on Purity, Hospitality, and Mortality. The Dixie Cup experiment is the very first sentence of the book because it is disgusting. And the psychology of disgust is the centerpiece of that book. You see, we have spent thousands of years as a human race learning how to be disgusted. It is crucial for our survival. In fact, some of the earliest writings on disgust psychology came from Charles Darwin himself, who suggests that disgust is an evolutionary development. Over thousands of years, through trial and error, we have learned what kind of things are safe and not safe. Think about food as an example. Why does rotten food smell bad? Because we've learned that it is toxic to eat. Why is meat from a black and white spotted cow more appealing to us than meat from an orange slimy lizard? Well, we have learned that they're much less likely to be poisonous. And why are we grossed out by a new food that we've never seen before? Because we know better than to eat something if we don't know what it is. And among these lessons, we've also learned things like what comes out of our bodies, we shouldn't try to put back in. Ugh. Hence the spit cup. The saliva in our mouths, it isn't disgusting. But when it leaves our mouth via spitballs and loogies and drool, suddenly it is. I bet you didn't expect to hear that in the sermon this morning. So after everyone drank from their cup in my interview 3 years ago, we talked about this evolution of disgust and how it hasn't stopped at just food and spit. The instinctual reaction of being grossed out by things from the outside or things that are unfamiliar has evolved beyond just practical survival skills and has become a central element of our morality. The psychological evolution is the reason why the ancient Jewish law aligned cleanliness and holiness. Just as it is the same reason why we hold implicit biases against people whose skin is a different color than ours, or who comes from a different country than us, or who lives in a different way than we do. We spent the rest of the lesson looking at verses from the Bible that teach us how to counter these disgust impulses so we can be more welcoming neighbors to immigrants and refugees. You see, disgust makes the world black or white. One of the reasons for this is a concept called negativity dominance, which means a little bit of something bad that comes in contact with something good means all of it needs to be thrown out. Again, from a practical survival standpoint, this makes sense. A little bit of poison in your cup makes it unsafe to drink. A little bit of mold on your food might make you sick. But this reaction is the same reason why if you're at a restaurant and there's a single hair in your food, you send back the whole plate. It's the same reason why a tablespoon of pee in the pool changes your mind about swimming. It's why a single positive COVID test in your office makes you feel the need to quarantine. It's practical. It makes sense, but it doesn't stop there. Think about the way this idea of negativity dominance interacts with your daily lives. When you're laying in bed at night and you have that one scene looping through your head, is it usually the best part of your day? Or is it that one time when 2 years ago you were at a party and you told that joke that you didn't realize at the time was maybe a little bit racist and nobody laughed and then it got really awkward? Yeah, those are the things that run through our minds. For some reason, the bad stuff seems to be more potent there. And this is why disgust plays such a big role in legalistic forms of religion. Legalism wants black and white. It wants clean lines. So in every situation, there are two options, one that God likes and one that God doesn't like. The law is very clear that you are supposed to wash your hands before and after every meal. It's right there in plain sight, black and white. It's easy to follow and to understand. And whether it's in religion or not, we are still susceptible to this kind of legalistic thinking today. Think about political discourse, for example. Politics today are so polarizing that everyone in one party or another, whether you're a voter or a representative, is expected to be basically in line on every one of the issues. If you stray from your party platform at all, if you have a little bit of their thinking in you, then you're a blue dog or a rhino or some other form of traitor to your team. Disgust psychology says it's all or it's nothing. When I was in college, I interned for a few months at the Underground, which was a meal site for young people who lived outdoors. And once a week, they gathered in the gymnasium of a church downtown, getting warm and dry, eating the best food offered by any communal meal in the city, and having fun. They played lots of games, but the highlight of every week was bingo. Everyone was excited to play bingo. The founder of the site, he would pull the numbers, and when you got bingo on your card, you got to go up and you got to choose your prize, either a $1 bill or a cigarette. Most people chose the cigarette. And when I first experienced this, I was a bit uncomfortable. Smoking kills people. So how are we doing ministry if we are enabling that? But then I learned about the value of a cigarette as currency in their community, and how sometimes a small escape with nicotine can be the very thing that makes you want to keep living. And I've since talked about this experience at the Underground with quite a few folks who are Christian, and some of them have outright discredited the whole thing because of the option to choose a cigarette at the end of the bingo game. It's as if just a tiny bit of sin in the whole ministry makes the entire thing rotten. I wonder how those people would feel about Jesus turning water into wine. He used up the water for the ritual washing. Maybe that's even a sin. He knew the law. He knew how it would look. He decided this act of love was more important. Tomorrow, we celebrate the life of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Dr. King took on disgust full force in his leadership of the civil rights movement during the segregation era. Talk about legalism, about black and white, separate seats, separate schools, separate drinking fountains. Don't let anything be contaminated. And how did he lead in the midst of this? With radical love. They sat quietly where they weren't allowed, they marched peacefully where they weren't wanted, and they refused to lift a hand in violence, regardless of if their oppressors made the same choice. They loved their enemies. And in the book Unclean, Richard Beck explains what Jesus and Dr. King have already demonstrated. That one of the most effective ways to counter the influence of disgust in our lives is with radical hospitality. Hospitality works because it is inherently vulnerable and intimate. Think about letting someone into your home. Now they know where you live, where you sleep, maybe where you keep your valuables. It's like the scene from the movie The Blind Side, where after giving Big Mike the couch to sleep on for the night, Sandra Bullock's character asks her husband, "You don't think he'll steal anything, do you?" Hospitality is vulnerable. And hospitality is also intimate, because when you let somebody in, they are able to see your junk too. You know how this goes. You walk into someone's house and immediately you can learn so many things about them. How much money they might have or not have, if they're generally clean or untidy, if they prefer TV or books. You can skim through the titles of their DVD collection and learn so much about them and what they are interested in. Not to mention if they have photos up on the wall of their families. When we let people in, we're opening ourselves up as well, and that can be scary. Because here's one last thing about disgust. It's a fear response. If you can recognize the things that you're afraid of, you'll probably also be finding the things that disgust you, and then you'll probably also find the things that you are staying away from. Again, for survival, this makes perfect sense. But again, it doesn't stop there. If you're afraid of snakes, you're probably not adopting many from the local pet store. If police officers are more afraid of people with certain skin colors, they're probably not doing a good job protecting them. And if you're afraid of people who are unvaccinated, how are you doing at loving them? Do not be afraid is one of the most common verses in our Bible. And I don't bring that up to say that fears aren't valid or rational or even completely necessary sometimes, because they are. What I do mean to say is this: when fear and disgust take control in our lives, they steer us counter to the way of love. So my prayer for us as a church is that we can continue to grow in recognizing our own fear and disgust impulses so we can fight against them and go out and do the work of love. Do not be afraid.